Hi there, welcome to this session on building financial statement reports in Power BI. My name is Rishi. I'm a principal consultant, group manager at Avanade. I used to be part of Altius, we got acquired start of the year. I'm a data platform Microsoft MVP. I'm also a chartered accountant by background. And there's two main communities I run at the moment. One is called powerplatformfinance.com, which is obviously very relevant to this subject, which is around looking at how analysts can use the Power Platform to build financial reports and financial analysis, and learndatainsights.com, which is all about helping people prepare for Microsoft exams with quizzes and courses and so on. So what we're going to look at today is it's quite a broad area. So to give you a little bit of background, I've been running a course with about 10 to 12 people for the most part of this year, where we've been going through a whole series of quite deep dive technical topics, going all the way from scoping all the way to building reports. And now we're looking at things like write back capability, modeling. So we're going into even more advanced topics now, but this is kind of a synopsis of what we've covered so far. And what I'm going to do in this session is give you a very high level overview of that. Given that each of these are probably sessions in their own right, we're not going to be able to cover all of them, and we're going to cover them at a fairly high level of detail. So we tried to get to a point where we can show the Power BI matrix, and then I can do a follow-up session where we can go through some of the things we're looking at: paginated reports, use of custom visuals, and actually building financial statements in Excel, and then embedding them into a Power BI app. So we'll start with kind of an overview, then go into scoping, and we'll have a look at some of the data and have a look at what we're going to end up with. Let's have a look at some of the data that we will use to build our financial statements reports. So if we open up the list of files, we can see we have transaction data, and lots of attribute files, dimension tables that we're going to look at later as well. So in our main transaction file, in actuality, our data is coming from SQL, but here we can see a sample. We see we have date, we have accounts, links to our chart of accounts, and we have debit and credit amounts in local currency. So we'll need to convert those into USD, our reporting currency, and in organizational unit. We also had lots of different types of transactions, so expenses, deposits, journal entries. And these don't all have the same columns. Some of them will, for example, relate to a supplier or customer, whereas others won't. If we then look at some of the other ones, we have organizational unit. So next to each org unit there, we have the currency, the local currency of that organizational unit. And we also then have our chart of accounts. So here we have whether it's balance sheet or income statement, the type, and the chart of accounts hierarchy is reflected here. So where chart of accounts roll up into each other, we have a parent ID here that allows us to identify what that hierarchy looks like. We then also have our invoice summaries. Now, these are not actually transactions. These are actually Excel files that we send to each customer for each month, with all of the invoices for that month in there. So we'll have to format those and ingest those as a data source, the formatted Excel files. We have address details here. And we also have vendor details and customer details that have billing address, which then relate to our addresses table. So we've got to join these things together, lots of different scattered data. Let's now look at what kind of income statement we will end up with in Power BI. So the first one we could look at is our standard matrix visual. And as we see here, this is in a Power BI format. We're using a standard matrix. We have a choice between whether we use reporting currency or local currency. So here we're showing things in dollars and reporting currency. If we change that in the filter pane, that would change into local currency if we selected a specific organizational unit. We've got our FS line headers, and then we've got our subtotals. So we've got things like total income, total cost of sales, gross profit percentage, and we've got some blank lines in between. So we have this as a fixed format income statement, which is using the standard matrix visual in Power BI. We also have some other visuals. So here we can see Zebra BI. So we have some custom visuals that we're using to also represent that. And we have a paginated report visual. So if we let this load, this is going to give us a perfectly formatted income statement that has our backgrounds, that has exactly how we want the formatting to appear. So we've been able to get this pixel perfect report, and we can actually export this to to Excel or to PDF format, for example. So if we click on the export there, we can click on PDF. That will take a couple of seconds. And if we open that up, then we will then see that in the browser, and you'll see that it's preserved all of our formatting and it's brought in exactly how we wanted it to appear. So in our data files, there was a particular Excel file which was one that we made ourselves. So it wasn't one of the ones that came with our data, and it was called the FS lines table. This was our own Excel file which was allow us to have meta-driven financial statements in Power BI. Let's have a look at this file and then we can see how it will be used. So we can see that we have the lines on here that we want in our financial statements. So this is what we can put against the rows of our matrix. Now, while some of these will be charts of accounts, and actually the way we've done this here is that all of our level 3s do relate to a chart of account names. Our level 1, level 2s are custom. So we're defining what we want to show as level 1, level 2, and then level 3 is the chart of accounts line. So we're looking at defining our own roll-up hierarchy, if you like, for the financial statement. And we can see here that we've got our subtotals, we've got income, operating expenses, EBITDA, gross profit. So we've got blank lines. We've also got calculations in there. So things like utilization percentage, gross profit percentage. And each of those are defined in order, level 1, 2, and 3 order. And we can see that each of these has a different type of calculation. So if it's an FS line total, for example, that means that it's coming from the chart of accounts. If it's custom, it means that we're defining our own custom calculation. So for those, each row, we're defining where it's coming from. Is it coming from our data that's just linked to the chart of accounts? Is it a running total? Or is it a custom calculation? Or is it a blank line? And then to the right, we have the format where we can choose, do we want to show this as a heading or ratio or subtotal? And we can use that in conditional formatting. Once we have those user stories, we can put them into a scoping template. This allows us to go from user stories to the specific business questions that we want to answer. And actually, our measures and dimensions, our actual numerical values, and what we want to slice and dice by in order to have requirements for a reporting solution. So this scoping template is an example, it's an Excel Word document provided. And we start in the first column with the user audience. We then look at the dashboard, the area, and the problem statement for this specific user. And then we look at the key questions that this user has. So it could be things like, what is my revenue and profit? Am I doing better or worse compared to the same period last year? How much better or worse? It's really important that we capture context in here. We then look at the KPIs and measures that would answer those questions, and what would we want to view and filter them by. We also then look at a very high level what the data sources are that would help us to be able to capture that data that we need. Before we build a report, it's also important to think about how we want this to be structured. Are we doing this as an ad hoc report, which we're really using for ourselves, or are we doing this for other people to access as we want to publish it as an app? How are we going to manage distribution of that? And also, how are we going to manage access to the data? Do we want other people to be also able to use the data models, the data sets that we build as part of this report? Do we want people to be able to access underlying raw data with a different set of logic that they can apply on top? So are we creating connections to a database, for example, that would be better to do once rather than every single time people producing their own reports and connecting to data sources again and reinventing the wheel. So it's really important for us to think about how we can have an architecture that supports that reusability. And this is the overall architecture that we have here. And we have our data, our artifacts, organized into different workspaces. So workspaces are collections of artifacts that we can organize, and we have them split into, for example, general data workflow. Now, data flow workspace. So this contains our data flows that have our generic corporate data, so things like dates and customers and employees. We have our domain specific workspaces that contain domain specific data, so in this case our finance data and our data sets. We then have our reporting workspaces where we have fin reports connected to those data sets that allow us to be able to then have in our own workspace. And we have management reporting workspace, and access to these is controlled by AAD groups and published as apps. And then we also have workspaces that actually other people can connect into those data flows to create their own business units, to create their own self-service business unit workspaces. So here they're connecting to a linked entity in our data flow. And finally, they produce their own reports, again, based on those data flows. They have their own reports and publish as their own apps. So this is the overall real architecture we need for self-service BI. Now we're going to use data flows to connect to our transaction data, which is actually stored in a SQL Server database and an on-premise SQL Server database. So we've set up the data source as a gateway. We can see here we've got the SQL Server, that's the server, that's the database. So now in our workspaces, we go to New, Data Flow, we define new tables, and we choose a source here. These are the same kind of connectors that we have in Power Query and in Power BI Desktop. But here we check SQL Server databases, and we put in the server and database name that we had on there. And we can see that it automatically populates the credentials for us, the credentials to connect to this database. This is really handy because it means actually once we've set it up centrally as a gateway, we don't need to have the data flow creators know what those credentials are. It's been set up centrally by IT as a gateway, so they're just passed in to that connection and they can be utilized. And here we can now bring in our finance transaction tables. We're just going to bring a couple in here for an example. If we click on transform data, and here we can apply any types of transformations that we could in normal Power BI Desktop as well. So we can things like group and unpivot or unpivot columns. We can change the data types. We can add columns, including column from examples or custom function columns even. If we save and close this now, we're not going to apply any at this stage. And we can give it a name. So if we call this here finance transactions, and click save. And by default our data doesn't have any data in it. Our data flow doesn't have any data in it. So we can click on refresh now, or we can set a refresh schedule. But if we go back into our workspace now, we can see that that finance transactions data flow has been created. And if we click on settings, we can see all of the various gateway connection settings. Data source credentials are not required because they're set at the gateway level. We can set up scheduled refresh, so we can choose to bring in new data from our database up to 8 times a day on Pro or 48 times a day on Premium. So we can add times there. And for if it's a premium data flow or workspace, we can choose to use the enhanced compute engine, which will improve performance when we're querying it, for example, from Power BI Desktop, so we can pass queries back into it using query folding, for example. We also have the endorsement option, where we can promote this data flow and say this is a data flow that's ready for wide consumption. We can also certify it to say this is the single version of truth for this data. And this needs to be, in order to be able to certify it, we need the permissions to be set in the tenant admin settings. We need our user to be as part of an AD group that's allowed to certify data flows and data sets. Let's now look at the complete file that has all of our data flows and data shaping in there. So this is a table which we now end up with our dimensions and our 2 fact tables, our general ledger and our trial balance that we want at those 2 different levels of granularity. So we start off with actually having a parameter to determine which environment, because if you remember, we had two types of data flows. We had dev and prod connecting to two different databases. So actually when we change this parameter, it will change which data flow it connects to. We also then just have a parameter to determine which version of the FS lines table that we need to bring in. So in this one, we're just bringing in the income statement one. And we have our staging queries as we set up earlier. So our finance transactions for our invoices, our finance dimensions, and our exchange rates, our calendar table, and our FS lines table. We then bring in all of our finance transactions, which have a source of the finance transaction staging, and then bringing in the data as we did in the previous step, and we have all of those there. Now what we do with some of these is we actually then also bring in our dimensions, so it's in the same way, and for some of these we do actually need to rename some of the columns, for example, because when we want to conform across these, for example for customers and vendors, we wanted to combine them into a single table. But in order for that to be able to combine into the fields correctly, we changed it to third party name rather than customer name, so that both for customers and for vendors, for example, we can see that it has third party name. And then we can we had a flag there as well for what the third party type is. And then we have our general ledger staging table, and this has all of the first step of this is to combine our transactions together. So we combine our transaction tables, transaction queries, and we select only the columns that we need, and we remove nulls. So we replace them with NA, for example, and we replace what we need in terms of that general ledger staging. We then take general ledger staging as a source, and we merge our fields in together, because what we want to end up with is our fact table, our general ledger table, only to have numerical dimension keys and numerical values. So in order to do that, we need to make sure we can link into the keys here, and where we had dimensions that didn't have a key, we created one using add column index column, so created what's known as a surrogate key. And we also merged back onto our exchange rates in order to, so what we did is we took our debits and credits in local currency, merged on org unit to bring in the currency value, merged that back onto exchange rates, and then for P&L type accounts, so looking in our chart of accounts attributes, for P&L we took the daily exchange rate, the transaction date exchange rate, and for balance sheet we took the month end one. We then have our general ledger at the end, and finally we have our trial balance, which is taking that as a source and grouping. So grouping our trial balance by end of month date, so that was an attribute we added just to put out end of month. So we did add column date, end of month date, and then grouped it by end of month date and account ID and org ID, and gave us the total amount in USD and the total amount in local currency. We've now loaded in all of our data from our data flows, and we have our tables here. So we have our fact tables, our general ledger and trial balance, and as a naming convention I've prefixed those with underscore so that they appear at the top. And then we have our dimension tables underneath. Again, similar naming convention, chart of accounts, FS lines, org units. And we can see those tables here. So we can see our two fact tables, our general ledger and trial balance, linked in by the various dimensions that we have available. Now we need to design our report and to work out what we want to show, as well as build some core measures for that. So first thing is what we want to do in terms of layout, and here's where we can mock up storyboards, so we can use that scoping template to design the story that we want to tell on our report page. How would we answer those questions? What kind of visuals could we use? So we want to format an income statement to be able to have that, and that's the key thing we're going to build out now. But we also have some cards along the top to show us our revenue in month to date, quarter to date, year to date, and we have a bridge table showing key movements and drivers in the income statement amount. So firstly, let's go and just format our page. So we've created a background, so we can do that here and import that in and set that to transparency 0%. And we can go in and also choose a theme. So we can do browse for themes. We've created a theme file, a JSON file that contains our PPF color palette. So now when we create our visuals, we're using the PPF color palettes there, and we're ready to start building our income statement as we start to build some of the measures, which we'll look at next. We now want to create our base measures. So what we can do is, first thing, we're going to put our measures into its own measures table. So we're going to do this actually back in the transform data. We're just going to go to enter data, and we're just going to create a blank table here called measures. And I'm actually doing a double underscore here, so this appears right at the top, and it's just going to be a blank table, just somewhere to house our measures. There are some pros and cons of this approach, but I quite like having a single place to organize all of the measures. All of the measures we build are going to sit in there. Now what we can do is start to create some very simple measures. So modeling, new measure, and we want to create our total amount in local currency and also in reporting currency. So we'll start with total amount local currency, and all these values are in our trial balance. This is really what we're basing our financial statement on. So if we do sum, trial balance, and then total amount local currency, and we can do the same thing for total amount reporting currency. Or total amount USD, we called it there, which is our reporting currency. And now what we want to do is be able to have a slicer that chooses whether we want to show the amount either in total amount local currency or in reporting currency. So what we can do is we can have a disconnected table that then allows us to put things as a slicer. So we can define this table either using transform data in there, and we can just type in the values, local currency, reporting currency, but we're actually going to use a slightly different approach. We're going to create a table in DAX this time, and what we're going to do is actually do it as a what's called a junk dimension table. So if I'll copy and paste this in. Now this is creating a table, and it uses the data table function in DAX for us to define the currency selection, and we want two values in there, one reporting currency and one local currency. And the reason I'm doing that is because actually we might have some other dimensions that we want to do as well, and rather than creating a separate disconnected table for every one of those, we can just create a single one there. So now if we have our junk dimensions table, and we have a currency selection, and we can put that on the page, for example, or as a filter selection, put it as a slicer, and maybe even actually we'll do single select on those because we need to either choose one or the other. And actually let's have horizontal layout so it looks a little bit like buttons, and get rid of the slicer header there as well. So now we've got kind of slicers that look like buttons, so we can choose between local currency and reporting currency. What we need to do now is then write a measure that's going to look at what's selected there. And I'm just going to, again, for ease of reference, I'm going to copy this in, but then we'll talk through that. So, wrong. Copy paste. So now we have the selected currency. So we're looking at the selected value of what's in our junk dimensions table, and by default it's reporting currency. And if we're looking at local currency, we want to make sure that we've got one org unit selected, because it doesn't make sense for us to sum amounts in euros and GBP, for example, together. So we check this, we put that as a variable, and then we say look at what's been selected. If reporting currency, then we can do our trial balance total amount USD, and actually we could just here put the measure because we've already created one actually, so we can just do total amount reporting currency. And then here, and again, we could have done total amount local currency here as well. So if one org selected, then we do total amount local currency, otherwise we return blank, because it doesn't make sense to sum amounts from different currencies. So now we have our total amount, and we can drag that onto the field here, put that as a card visual, and it's giving us a blank because we've got local currency, we haven't selected anything, but if we put reporting currency, we can see the amount there. And actually, if we change that and we put in org name as a slicer, so that we're making sure, and actually let's put this as, well, we don't have single select because we can have reporting currency, but now if we select a single organizational unit, we can see that it actually shows us the amounts for that organizational unit in local currency. We now have our total amount measure, and we want to create some other measures for things like revenue, gross margin, net profit, and utilization. So what we can do is we could utilize the fact that we have our data categorized already in our chart of accounts by these. So if we were working with this in Excel, we'd have to start doing lookups on our accounts and data to kind of bring in its classification. But here we can see the classification already part of the chart of accounts. So we can have revenue and expense, asset, equity, liability, for example. And we can even go back down into specific details. So we can use for example, the total amount to now then create another measure to look at total revenue. So we'll use total amount as a base. So if we do total revenue, and the way that we can use one measure as a base for another is by using calculate. So calculate allows us to change the filter context. So we apply the measure that we want to have as a base, in this case total amount, but we want to look at total amount, but actually where our chart of accounts classification is revenue. And this gives us then our total revenue number, which if we look at here, and again if we put it into reporting currency, we can now see that we have an amount for total revenue. And we can do a similar thing for some of the other measures. So if we do now total cost of goods sold, calculate again total amount, and we don't want to use the local currency or reporting currency ones anymore. Those were just to give us our total amount, so we're creating a base measure on top of some other measures, and this is a good way to build up those measure chains, so we're not having to create total revenue local currency, total revenue reporting currency, and then cost of goods sold, repeat all of those. So we could use calculation groups as another way to avoid this, but here we're just building on our base measures and making sure that we're using a high enough level of a base measure. So here we do again chart of accounts, and we can actually look at this one as account type. So here we've got account type equals cost of goods sold, and measures can also reference other measures as we can see here. So when we look at gross profit, for example, we can just do total revenue plus total cost of goods sold. The cost of goods sold will be in negative numbers here, so we can do a plus rather than a minus there. And again, we can build a measure on top of that to say gross profit percentage or gross margin, divide gross profit. So again, we're taking our measures and just building upon them, and divide that by total revenue. And we could do a similar thing, for example, with utilization that we're looking at earlier. Whilst we're able to calculate our numbers and revenue and gross margin, all of those numbers now with our measures that we have, we're also calculating them for every period in time, which doesn't really make any sense. We want to look at monthly numbers or yearly numbers. So what we can do is put a slicer or a filter for looking at a particular month. So in this case, if we want to look at a particular month and year, we can drag that on to our canvas here. And we can see that this is actually sorted, but if it's not, we can go into here, sort by column, and do month year number. So we're sorting the month by month year number, because by default that will sort alphabetically. And we can see here we've got all of our date table fields coming in from every single month that we have loaded in, because our calendar table contains all of those dates. But perhaps what we want to do is just restrict it to dates where we actually have data. So to do this, we can use the filters pane, and we have with the slicer selected, we have filters on this visual, and we can do a measure filter. So we could put in there our total amount and bring that into there and say show items where value is not blank. Apply filter, and now it's only showing months for which we have data. Now before we leave, let's just actually format some of our numbers here as well, because we can see that we've got 1.51M and it doesn't look particularly neat. So what we can do is go into the relationships view, that's where we do it for some reason, and we can select our measures here, so gross profit, all our numerical ones, and actually reporting currency, local currency we're going to hide, so we don't need to do those, but if we select those ones, and if we go down here to format and put in a custom format string, and now we can put in a format string that we can take from Excel, for example. So this one is showing with dollars, so by default we're showing everything in reporting currency, and it shows negative numbers in brackets. So now if we put that in there, and whilst we're here, let's just hide these as well. So hide in report view the local currency and reporting currency, because these are just being used to give us our total amount. And now when we go back to our canvas, we can see that we have those formatted correctly as well. It's also quite a common requirement for us to show monthly, quarter to date or year to date values. So we have a given month selected here, so we could go down and choose if we want to show for March or for April, for example, May. But actually it would be quite good to also be able to select whether we want to show this as a month value or quarter to date or year to date. And so we can have another slicer like we did here for local currency versus reporting currency. And rather than creating a separate disconnected table for that, we could again also use the calculation group, but here what we'll do is modify our junk dimension table to include this row as well. So if we now add into here, if we now define another variable, so if we do period selection equals, and just going to copy and paste this in here, but it's just a data table function again as well, where it's this time we're saying period selection, and we have the strings month to date, quarter to date and year to date. Now in order to be able to use both of these effectively on the same page as the slicer, we don't want one filtering out the other, which will happen if they're part of the same table. So the way we're going to get around that is actually by doing a cross join of both our currency selection and our period selection for our junk dimensions table. And this will allow us just to have every combination of all of the values we have in here, so that even if we select them, we'll still have all of the other options. For if we select a currency selection, we'll have all of the period selections still available. If we select reporting currency, we'll still have month to date, quarter to date, year to date still available from there. And it's a disconnected table, so it's not really going to make any difference in terms of those relationships. So now we can add the value on there, and we can do period selection. And again, just format that as a slicer. We can do the same formatting. In fact, we can just apply format painter to those. So now we've got our similar selections there. Now what we need to be able to do is define a total amount by period measure. So now if we So again, what we can do, and I'll copy and paste some DAX into here, but then we could just run through that and see what it's doing. So again, we're using selected value to look at what we've got selected in our junk dimensions table. We can then see if month to date is selected, we can just return a total amount, because by default it will filter for that month. If quarter to date is selected, we use calculate total amount date QTD. So we're using time intelligence here because it automatically picks up that we have that in our that we have a date field in there, so we just pass in the date field, and same with year to date. And if we select something on there, total amount by period, so by default I think this might give us blank. So what we can do is make sure that we've marked our calendar as a date table. So we go to mark as date table, date, and hopefully that will give us some values. So we've got local currency there, so now we've got total amount by period, and we could format that measure. What we can also now do is go back to our measures here, and some of our base measures, rather than doing total amount, we can actually replace those by total amount by period. So actually, when we have our next level of measures there, we can go back and say actually we want to do total amount by period rather than total amount. So we just changed that level above now that we've got another base that we've built upon the total amount. So just that only those measures that refer directly to total amount, not any other measures, but now we can just replace those, and we've got our measures all then working. So now if we look at that monthly to date, if we look at quarter to date, and then year to date for May, it's giving us those different figures. We're now ready to start creating our income statement matrix, and I'm actually going to do this in the PPF core dataset file, even though obviously we want it in our report file, but just because it's easier to create everything here, and this is actually where we want to build in new measures that we want to build, especially those core ones that are not formatting related, and then once we're ready we can publish this again, refresh our fin report, and copy and paste the visuals over. So that's just an easy way for development. So now if we create the matrix here, and we have a matrix visual, and rather than using the chart of accounts here, if you recall, we have an FS lines table which defines the rows and the order we want them in our income statement. So if we use FS lines here now, we can put in level 1, level 2 and level 3, and we can actually see that the order of these is not quite coming up how we'd want. And if we go into here in level 3 and sort by column and sort by level 3 order, it doesn't actually let us, because we've got blank values in there and we've got the blanks repeated across multiple rows. So what we can do there is actually, just to as a kind of quick workaround, we can go back into the transform data and temporarily remove the blank rows that we want from here. So if we go into our FS lines table, and if we just filter out anything with blank in it, let that create the line back again, and now we should be able to sort them back. So we sort by column, sort by level 3 order, and we can do the same thing for level 1 and level 2, sort by level 1 order and level 2 order, and we can see now this is working. This is now giving us income, total income, cost of sales, total cost of sales, and now we can go back in and actually remove that step to remove the blanks, and our sort orders will still retain. So that's just a quick workaround for that. Although we will notice here that we don't have all of the lines that we had in our financial statements lines once we drag in a value. So at the moment we do, we can see we've got gross profit percentage, but once we drag in our values, so say we drag in total amount by period, then we'll see that actually those all disappear, because it's not showing us lines against which we have blanks. So if we did, for example, show items with no data, then we'll see that we've got those rows come back and we can look at gross profit percentage, but it's showing blank because these can't evaluate. So actually, rather than doing the blanks, what we want to do is actually have a switch statement that's going to look at what's selected here, what type of line is selected here from our FS lines table, and then return a corresponding value here. So if it's running total, it returns a running total calculation. If it's a FS line total, then it returns the value, and if it's a custom calculation like this, then it returns our measure that we've defined for that. So we'll do that in the next session, but for here, we've got a blank against all of these, and these are all the chart of account lines which actually don't relate to our income statement at all. So if we just apply a filter on this page, And obviously we need to replicate this in our report for financial statement and make sure that it's just income statement on there. So now we have the starting point for that. Now we have our income statement, and some of these lines are being populated automatically from our total amount by period measure. And the reason for that is because these lines, even though we've defined them in FS lines table, we've also defined a relationship between FS lines and our chart of accounts. So our FS lines goes into chart of accounts. So if we see here, we've got a relationship between our level 3 and our chart of accounts fully qualified name. So that allows us to then create that relationship there and utilize that relationship. So anything in FS lines that's categorized as income, we can flow through to chart of accounts and say all the lines here that we have a level 1 in income, all of those corresponding accounts that are a level 3 in our FS lines table, then go into via chart of accounts, and they give us the total amount by period from our general ledger. So those are all working fine. But the reason we have blanks in some of these is because it's then saying, okay, so FS line 1 is total income, and underneath total income it's just a line that has total income. There's only one line. So if we look at the total income line in our FS lines table and we filter that for, say, total income, we can see it's just one line here that we've inserted into our FS lines table to give us a total, and it's the same as level 2, level 3. We've just put it in the right order there, and we see we've got type there of running total. But now it's filtering for a chart of accounts line. Level 3 is total income, and it's finding any chart of accounts with the name of total income, and of course that doesn't exist. It's a total that we've inserted, hence it returns a blank value. So what we need to be able to do is look at, if we go back to our FS lines title, if we look at, clear all the filters from here, and we look at what we've got in our calculation type. So all the ones that have FS line totals relate to chart of accounts from our level 3 link there. So we can use those. All the ones that are total income, total cost of sales are actually running total, as is gross profit. We also then have category totals. So if we have a look at those, we've got total operating expenses, total cost of sales. So those are where we don't want to do a running total, so we don't want to include the revenue numbers. We just want it where our category is operating expenses or cost of sales. And if we also then look at our custom, we can see things like our cost income ratio, gross profit percentage, and utilization percentage all fall under that calculation type. So what we can do next then is use these calculation types and define a separate measure or calculation for each of these, and then return the right one according to whatever line we're showing here. So if we're showing a line that essentially is an FS line total, then it knows how to aggregate those up. So now we want to be able to create different measures or different calculations for each of the calculation types that we have here. Apart from blank and blank, we can just return blank. But FS line total already works with our total amount by period, so we can just return that. And then for category total, running total, and custom, we need to define our own separate measures, and then we can look at which one is in scope of our matrix and then return the corresponding measure. So if we go back into here and we create a new measure, so this one we want to create running total. So, and for ease of use, I'll copy and paste some DAX in here, and then we'll run through what that's showing. So the first thing we're doing is looking at the level 3 order. So in order to have a running total, so where we can have total income and we can have gross profit as a running total calculation, it's just an easier way rather than defining all of the calculations separately. So what we can do there is look at the level 3 order, because each row in our income statement had a sequential order, and actually that level 3 order was the lowest one. So that gives us our current order. We can then say calculate total amount by period, and because we're looking at a particular line on the FS lines table, and each row of our matrix we need to remove that scope, so we use all, or we could use remove filters here. We then look at calculation types where they're FS lines total, and we sum up all of those where the level 3 order is less than this currently selected one in scope. So this is essentially a cumulative totals pattern that we could utilize here to give us a running total. And if we put that in, we should be able to see, put that measure into there, total amount in total, and if we put that into, I think here we can actually see that we start with 1.5 million, take off 428, we get to a running total of 1 million, and then down here operating expenses 693k, we're down to 386, and then we end up back with our net profit, same figure in here. So this is actually our running total number, and we can check that this is working correctly. We now actually just want to add in then, and let me just move that back to the measures table. We now want to create 2 more measures for our category total. And again, this is looking at what we've got selected as our category, and it's giving us all of those, again with all of the FS lines, and just filter them down to the selected category. When we say selected value here, we're really meaning what is the category that's in scope. So if it's operating expenses, it will say operating expenses the category, look at all the FS lines total, filter it down for operating expenses and give us the total of that, and that will give us our total amount category. And lastly, we just need to put in our custom calculation. So here, if we do a custom calculation here, I think we called this something else. So gross profit percentage. So here we look at our custom calculation. We look at what's been selected in the row of the custom calculation name. So this was one of the fields that we had in our FS lines table. If it's gross profit, then give us our gross profit calculation, but actually just calculate it with respect to all of the FS lines, so not just obviously the FS line that's in scope. We haven't actually created a utilization or cost income ratio in this particular example, but we have those created, and we'll come and fix those before we look at the next one. So that's going to give us an error at the moment, but that's fine. And if we now then, the last thing we need to do is create 2 more measures. One is for our format string, and this is to be able to format our currencies depending on whatever we specified in whether we've selected reporting currency or local currency. So it's going to give us a format string, and if you remember in our org units table we had our format string defined as a column there, so we can just use that, and this will use this in our FS lines total. And now we define our core measure, which is our FS lines value. So if we create our FS lines total measure, so now here again we're looking at the calculation type. If it's just an FS line total calculation type, we return the total amount by period. If it's a running total, we return our running total measure. Category total, return our category total measure. Custom calculation, otherwise we return blank. And then we return the calculation value, whichever one we have there, we put that as a variable, and we use the selected format string, which is what we have as our currency format string up here. So now this should give us an FS lines total, but obviously it's referencing the custom calculation total. So once we fix that, we can go back and check that that all works correctly. Lastly, with our income statement matrix here, we want to apply some formatting. So in terms of style, let's change that to say minimal, and actually we can get rid of our total amount by period now because we've got our FS lines total. And we want to apply some conditional formatting on here. So what we can do is format the font color depending on what we have in our FS lines total as the style that we wanted. So we had a format here, we had normal, blank, heading, ratio, subtotal. So we could define a separate font color and indeed background for those. So these are actually kind of formatting measures we should really put in the fin report, but for now we'll just put them in here. And what we can define is a measure in order to format it. And when we conditionally format, we can actually pass in a hex code for the color that we want. So here we can say, look at what's been selected, and by default it selects normal. So if it's normal, it returns black, so it will just be a font color of black. And if it's a subtotal, we also want it in black, but then if it's a heading or a ratio, we want to choose a different color. So this is actually the hex codes that we're passing in, again based on our FS lines table. This is the real advantage of using this FS lines table for our formatting here. And then for the background, we'll apply a similar logic. So we'll say, look at what we've got selected, and accordingly choose a conditional color code for the background. So now we can say normal, and again white. So this is the FFFFF is white, and then subtotals and headings and ratios we apply with a different one. So now under the conditional formatting options of the matrix, so we have here conditional formatting, we can apply font color. That should give us the option on here. So now we format by field value because we're actually passing in a color code text. So we had a font color here, and we can see it's formatted out with a different font color, and we apply the same thing for a background color. Format by field value. And we can see these are now highlighted in grey with our conditional formatting applied. Let's also just take off the plus minus because we wanted these to be a fixed format income statement. And now this is looking like the income statement that we want. And lastly, let's just rename this FS lines total to be current period. And that's now then our income statement looking how we want it to.